Bible is the story of all stories and sums up all creation in her patterns. Since we are made for God and all hearts are restless in their desire for Him, God's story fulfills all other stories. This means despite many stories being twisted by sin, we will find some traces of symbolic and narrative patterns that appear in the Bible in unrelated stories. Today we will do this with Demon Slayer. In order to understand some of the things I'm going to talk about, we have to understand the nature of demons in this series. Basically, in this series, they are people who are marked out and distorted by evil. Most are reborn out of distorted relationships. This, by the way, is the reason why Nezuko is very different, because she has an intact relationship. In biblical terms, demon slayer demons are like those taken captive by Sheol and death to an extreme extent. They've ruined their lives. They have their bodies contorted and twisted and altered. And so it is with wicked people in the Bible, or at least in terms of wordplay they are. They are called crooked. Literally, the word iniquity means crooked or avon in the Hebrew Bible. This twisting or altering of people's lives and relationships is often what makes the powers and the theme of certain demons. Let's explore. In the Tsuzumi Mansion Arc, we have several contrasting uses of wisdom. We see this most clearly in the demon who is contorted into a being that has drums in his body, mainly using those in his hands to fight. What does that have to do with wisdom? Well, in the Bible, musical instruments have to do with the skill of your hands and wisdom. We largely see instruments enter the scene when David is called out to drive an evil spirit from King Saul. David is talked about like this. One of the young men answered, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." 1 Samuel 16:18 ESV. He is skillful in playing, and later in the chapter he is described as playing the lyre with his hand. So also is his kingly duty described in the skill of his hands at the end of the long poem in Psalm 78:72. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, and with skillful hands he led them. It is the kingly period and the kings which bring in music into the Bible in large part. For instance, when the first king, Saul, is called to become a king, he gets caught up in prophetic music. He gets caught up in the spirit through the music, and he gains his kingly spirit once he gets caught up in that prophetic music. After David drives evil spirits away and does all of that with his instruments, well, he writes the Psalms. He introduces instruments into worship in large part. He makes a whole big band of Levites who play instruments, and you have an explosion of musical activity and instruments in the Bible after that point. Kings in general have to do with wisdom as well. Solomon writes most of the wisdom literature, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. He asked for wisdom from God and is one of the wisest people ever at that point. He glorifies the tabernacle and builds the temple. Now that the association has been established, we can examine the villain's backstory. Our villain is a writer, or at least someone who wants to be. However, he is unskilled and lacks wisdom. He compensates for this lack of wisdom in his demon life with his hand and drum techniques. This is, however, a cheap route to power, and despite that, he still isn't skilled enough. He is basically put down by Muzan. He loses his position in the 12 Kizuki after a while because he's not skilled enough. He also never goes outside of his house. There are also some relations to a lack of kingly position here, but that's extra stuff. I'm not going to cover that right now. Moving on to our heroes. Inosuke, while strong, is prideful and therefore lacks sufficient wisdom to win the day. Zenitsu lacks sense generally. However, he has a sort of intuitive sense, as he can fight even in his sleep. Wise Tanjiro uses his kingly wisdom in order to defeat his enemy. Speaking of kingly wisdom, remember the list of things attributed to David? He was skillful, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, just like Tanjiro is. All of those things he uses to defeat the enemy in this arc. Next arc I'll cover is Natagumo Mountain. I'm not going to pay attention to the villains as much as the heroes here. Anyways, without further ado, in this arc there is a beginning of a movement from water to fire. Here we see at the end of the arc, we see the first person that Tanjiro encounters, Tomi no Kagiyu. He comes in the arena like a torrent, flooding the arena with his breath of water. Judgment by a flood is the first judgment on the world, like with the story of Noah. Tanjiro, in turn, must advance past the floods of judgment to the next type of judgment, judgment by fire. The whole arc of the Bible has a change in judgment from water to fire. This is especially evident in 2 Peter 3, 4 through 13. He makes this a focal point when talking about judgment on the world by Noah's flood, and then the fire of the next judgment on the old order, in making the new heavens and earth. We see both water and fire as images of blessing and judgment elsewhere in the Bible as well. Water especially has a bent towards blessing. Streams are a source of blessing in Ezekiel's temple, Psalm 46, etc. Abraham makes oases with the wells with which women are found at later, like the one in the Gospel of John, where Jesus talks about streams of living water. All of those images are related to the Spirit, by the way. Rains are a form of covenant blessing on Israel, etc. God has a river of water coming from his throne in Revelation, which is also a river of fire in Daniel. The church participates in this too. Fire comes out from Jeremiah's mouth to consume the people. A lot of this is very close to prophetic witness. Like in Revelation 11, we see the two witnesses who are prophets and martyrs. Fire comes out of their mouths. The church is part of the cleansing flood in baptism and in her prophetic witness to the world in general. Not only this, but God will use the unconverted nations as his destructive fire of judgment on occasion, and an undoing of creation like the flood, especially in the prophetic literature. You see this all of the time where Jeremiah 4, I think, talks about the world is basically uncovered, it's formless, everything's covered by the waters again, and there are countless images of judgment through the unconverted nations, especially in the nation of Israel. Let's turn to Tanjiro's sword. Tanjiro's sword is an exorcising sword. It's a sword of release from demonic curse, but also of wrath and righteous judgment. Just like the stream of water and fire from God's throne, it's at the same time sort of duality. But we also see this progression throughout the series. So he starts out with that breath of water, and then he moves towards the breath of fire, which we see it's more complicated than just a breath of fire, but the imagery is still there. Tanjiro uniquely has this duality, as opposed to other characters in the series, as he uniquely wields both of these styles at the same time. If you also think about this, in the Bible, there are certain images of knife and fire. There are various images like the cherubim outside of the garden, but I want to focus on knife and fire as they are used for sacrifices, when they go up to God as a pleasing aroma, offering and sacrifices. All of this is fitting because Tanjiro is also a sniffer of aromas. He smells the main villain of this arc, in fact. And he says that it's an aroma that's filled with hatred and fear with him and his family. Instead of smelling a pleasing aroma of trust, he smells that hatred and loathing, which stirs his wrath. We also see him ascending up a mountain and getting his fire style there. I won't go too much into this now, but this is very appropriate. In the Bible, mountains are places where one becomes more glorious, receives fire, all kinds. I mean, it's huge. So, and I'm also going to save the symbolism of the Hashira for later. We meet the Hashira after this. Since there are a lot of biblical ideas about pillars, but I haven't really fully explored that yet. So, yeah. Got a couple of things to say about Mugen Train, and this first one isn't really Bible related, but it is something that I've noticed. And I've noticed that the West and modern phenomenon are almost always portrayed as demonic in this series, and it comes to a head in this arc. For instance, the first appearance of Western clothing that comes to mind is on Muzan himself. This is how we first see him, and we see him in the city. The lower moon that we see in this arc is also wearing Western clothes, and even becomes a train. The train is the most powerful item of modernity we've seen in this series yet the thing is itself a demon, or at least it becomes one. And this series takes place in Meiji, an era of westernization and modernization, where all kinds of foreign things have come basically to devour and wreak havoc on old Japan if it doesn't conform to the sort of Enlightenment world order that we see during the Meiji era. We might recall that at the beginning of this adventure, we started in a small mountain village, which is relatively isolated, and then it gets attacked. Then we begin the story. It's sort of a microcosm of the whole feeling that I'm getting here. I'm not saying that the author intended this, or that's the only way Western culture is portrayed in this series, but it is sort of a pattern I've noticed. Something Christian theology related, but not necessarily Bible related, is the fact that we see a specific term tied to flames, especially flame breathing and the flame pillar, the flame Hashira. First, we see flames from Tanjiro in the form of divine fire and judgment, but here we see them from Rengoku Kyojuro, or we could call him Purgatory Kyojuro, as the kanji reads. His flames are the flames of purgatory. However, this is slightly different from purgative fire in Christian theology. Since Japan and the author of this series have not been evangelized, fire in this series is actually primarily destructive rather than purgative. This is the nature of fire when it's not on the altar of God, so this makes sense. Since Christians are the altar of God, when fire comes to them, it actually even renews them. It goes one step further than even purgation. The fire that comes on the altar of God, as in Christians, is a fire of renewal or remaking. The ultimate form of this is the death and resurrection of the bodies of believers. This also happens in the trials of life and when God enters the life of the believer as well. There are all kinds of different places. Most Christians would say this happens in baptism as well. In the Church of Rome, purgative fire is primarily after your death, and in Protestantism, it's primarily during life and at death. And if you think about what fire does to you, it's easy to see the renewal aspect as well. Fire burns you, and then when the burn heals, it comes out as this new, fresh, pink skin. And back to the series, as mighty as Tanjiro's Hinokami Kagura sounds, this is a series written by a non-Christian as far as I know, so we're probably not going to see a fire of renewal. Sorry, guys. Well, the next video after this is going to be the entertainment arc, and then after that I'll do the one that's currently being released in the anime form right now. I'm not going to go and read ahead in the manga and finish the series. I'm just gonna do it as the anime comes out, because it's really well done, it's really well made. So I kind of want to see it that way. So yeah.